The year was 1944. Flour cost more than last Tuesday. The electric bill had gone up again, and a woman named Edna Marsh stood at her kitchen sink at 6 in the morning before anyone else woke up, counting coins on a dish towel. She didn't call it a budget. She didn't read it in a book. Someone had shown her once, quietly, and she never forgot. 5 mason jars, lined up on a wooden shelf, each one holding something different, each one holding something back. But what happened next, no one saw coming.
Her real story didn't start with success. It started with a decision no one noticed. Edna Marsh was 31 years old in the spring of 1944. Her husband, Raymond, had been overseas for 14 months. She had 2 children, a house with a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink, and exactly $11.40 left until the end of the month. The war hadn't just taken men, it had taken prices with it, quietly, without announcement, like a thief who knew the back door. She stood at the kitchen table one Tuesday morning while the children were still sleeping. The light came through the curtains in thin yellow strips. She laid out every bill, every coin, every ration stamp she owned, and she didn't cry. She just looked. That stillness, that refusal to panic, was the first decision she ever made that truly changed things. Her neighbor, Mrs. Clara Webb, had mentioned the jars maybe 6 weeks earlier. It wasn't a long conversation. Clara had said it almost like passing weather news. "I keep my grocery money separate, Edna, in a jar. Can't spend what your hand can't reach." Edna had nodded politely and thought nothing more of it. But that Tuesday morning, standing over a table full of not enough, those words came back like a forgotten smell. She walked to the back pantry and pulled 5 mason jars from the shelf. They were the same jars she used for summer preserves, wide-mouthed, heavy glass, the kind that made a satisfying sound when you set them down on wood. She lined them up slowly, one by one. Each jar caught the morning light differently, and for a moment the kitchen felt less like a problem and more like a plan waiting to be named.
She didn't have labels. So she tore the brown edge off a paper grocery bag and cut 5 small strips with kitchen scissors. She wrote in pencil groceries, rent, utilities, children, savings, and folded each strip, pressing it beneath each jar like a quiet promise. Her handwriting was careful, not pretty, but careful. There's a difference. Careful means you're thinking. Pretty just means you practiced. The total she divided that morning was $11.40. It wasn't enough. She knew that before she started, but she divided it anyway, because something in her understood that a problem named is a problem half controlled. She gave groceries the largest share. Rent was already spoken for, but she kept a jar for it regardless, because seeing it sit there, untouched, gave her a discipline that numbers on paper never could. If you've ever wondered why physical cash feels harder to spend than a tap on a phone screen, Edna already knew the answer in 1944. The jar made money feel real, finite, serious. It asked something of you every time you reached inside, and that asking, that small moment of hesitation, was the entire system. She hadn't solved anything yet, but she had started, and starting, in the middle of wartime and worry and a leaking pipe nobody had fixed, that was everything.
What each jar was allowed to know. The jars sat on that shelf for 3 days before Edna touched them again, not because she forgot, because she was afraid to. There's a particular kind of fear that comes not from chaos, but from a system you've just built and aren't sure you can trust yet.
She would glance at them while washing dishes, while stirring oatmeal, while pretending to read the evening paper after the children were in bed. The jars just sat there, quiet and waiting, like a test she hadn't studied for. On the fourth day, she needed groceries. This was the first real moment. She walked to the shelf, reached into the jar labeled groceries, and counted out exactly what she'd allocated. No more. She folded the bills small and tucked them into her coat pocket, not her purse, her pocket, because a purse had other things in it, other temptations. A coat pocket only had one thing, and that one thing had a purpose. That small physical decision would save her more money over the next 8 months than any amount of willpower ever could have. The grocery jar held $2.80 that first week. It sounds almost cruel by today's measure, but in 1944, $2.80 could buy a pound of dried beans, a small soup bone, a tin of sardines, 2 sweet potatoes, a bag of cornmeal, and a handful of onions, if you knew the right shelf order and didn't let your eyes wander. Edna knew. She had learned, the way wartime women learned everything, through quiet repetition and the soft shame of coming up short once before.
The utilities jar made her the most anxious. Electric bills had a personality in wartime. Unpredictable, slightly threatening, always arriving at the worst moment. She kept a small notepad inside the utilities jar, folded twice. On it, she had written the last 3 months of electric bills in a column. Not to track trends, she wouldn't have called it that. She just wanted to see the number before it surprised her. Surprise, she believed, was how money escaped. If she saw it coming, she could brace, and bracing cost nothing. The children jar was the one that hurt to fill and hurt more to empty. It held money for school supplies, for the occasional piece of fabric to patch a knee, for a small treat on a Friday, a penny candy, a shared orange. She kept it deliberately thin, not from cruelty, but from clarity. She had watched other mothers on the street spend emotionally, buying small things to soften their own guilt, their own loneliness, their own fear that their children were suffering. Edna understood that impulse completely. She just refused to make decisions for her. The savings jar was almost empty in those first weeks. Some weeks it held a single dime, some weeks a nickel. She never skipped it entirely, not once, even when logic said there was nothing left to give. That jar wasn't about the amount, it was about the habit of believing the future deserved something. Even a nickel said, "I think tomorrow is coming. I think it's worth preparing for." In 1944, that kind of faith wasn't small. It was quietly revolutionary. The arithmetic of almost enough. The grocery store on Clement Street smelled like sawdust and cold metal in those days. The shelves weren't bare exactly, but they had gaps, deliberate and unsettling, like missing teeth in an otherwise familiar smile. Sugar was rationed, butter was rationed. Canned goods had a quiet hierarchy. The good ones disappeared by Tuesday, and whatever remained by Thursday had a dented lid or a faded label that nobody wanted to read too carefully. Edna walked those aisles the way a chess player moves, thinking 3 steps ahead, never reaching for the first thing her eyes found. She had developed what she privately called her ingredient rule. She never bought a finished thing when she could buy the parts of it cheaper. A box of cornbread mix cost more than cornmeal, salt, and a spoon of baking powder bought separately. A tin of prepared soup cost nearly double what a soup bone and dried vegetables would yield in her own pot. She wasn't cooking from scratch out of nostalgia or virtue. She was cooking from scratch because the mathematics demanded it. Every meal she made was a small act of financial reasoning disguised as dinner. Her ration book was dog-eared by March. The blue stamps were for processed foods, the red for meats and fats, each one a small square of permission in a world that had started asking permission for everything. She kept the book rubber-banded to the inside of the grocery jar, so she could never reach for money without also reaching for the reminder of what that money was allowed to buy. That pairing was intentional. Money, without its limits, she believed, always found a way to exceed them. The rubber band kept both things honest. She started writing her grocery list differently sometime in February. Instead of listing what she wanted to eat, she listed what she had left: half an onion, dried lentils, 4 potatoes going soft at one end, a heel of bread. Then she built the week's meals backward from those remnants. The soft potatoes became soup. The bread heel became a savory pudding the children called mystery cake and asked for again the following week without knowing what was in it. Waste in Edna's kitchen wasn't a moral failing, it was a financial leak she simply couldn't afford. One Thursday in late March, she came home from Clement Street with 11 cents unspent from the grocery jar. 11 cents. She stood at the kitchen counter and held the coins in her palm for a long moment. The children were in the yard. The house was quiet. She could have bought a small tin of peaches with those 11 cents. She wanted to. The wanting was real and specific, and she didn't pretend otherwise. But instead, she walked to the shelf, opened the savings jar, and dropped the coins inside. The sound they made against the glass, that small, bright clinking, stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon. That 11-cent decision was not about 11 cents. It was about the moment between wanting something and choosing something else. Modern behavioral economists would spend decades studying that exact gap, the space between impulse and intention. Edna didn't have the language for it, but she lived inside it every single week, and she knew its geography better than most. Every coin she chose not to spend was a vote for a version of her future that didn't yet exist. And she voted, quietly and consistently, with whatever the week had left over. The children never went hungry. That was the line she held above everything else. Some weeks dinner was thin, more broth than substance, more bread than protein, but it was warm, and it was hers, and she set the table the same way every night regardless. Cloth napkins, even fraying ones, a candle on Fridays, small rituals of dignity in the middle of scarcity, because she understood something about children that no budget book ever printed. They don't remember the shortage, they remember the feeling at the table, and she was determined that feeling would be calm. The month that bent but didn't break. It was the second week of April when the utility bill arrived. Edna heard the mail slot open and close from the kitchen, that familiar metallic snap, and she already knew before she crossed the hallway what was waiting on the floor. The envelope was thin and official, the kind that never carried good news. She picked it up without rushing, set it on the kitchen table, and finished drying the breakfast dishes before she opened it. That small delay wasn't avoidance, it was composure. She had learned that opening bad news with wet hands and a racing heart made the number inside feel larger than it was. The bill was $1.63. She had allocated $1.40 in the utilities jar. The difference was 23 cents. 23 cents doesn't sound like a crisis, but when every jar is already filled to its exact purpose and not a penny beyond, 23 cents is a wall. She sat down at the table and looked at the bill for a long moment without blinking. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a neighbor's child was laughing at something. Life, completely indifferent to her arithmetic, continued at full volume.
She had a rule against borrowing between jars. She had made that rule on the very first morning and spoken it aloud to herself like a contract, because rules spoken aloud carry more weight than rules only thought. But rules made in calm moments get tested in difficult ones, and this was a difficult one. She opened the children's jar and looked inside. There was 31 cents remaining for the week. She stared at it. She closed the jar. She sat back down. There are moments in financial life that aren't about money at all. They're about identity, about who you are when the system you built asked more of you than you planned to give. She borrowed the 23 cents from the children's jar. She wrote it down immediately on the small notepad she kept in the utilities jar. Borrowed 23 cents from children, April 14th, to be returned first. The writing was important. It transformed a compromise into a debt she owed herself, and debts written down have a way of getting paid. She didn't feel good about it. She didn't rationalize it into a non-event. She felt the full, small weight of it, folded the notepad, and put it back. Accountability, she understood, wasn't punishment. It was just honesty with consequences attached. The inflation that spring was a quiet kind of cruelty. Prices moved in small increments, a penny more on cornmeal, 2 cents added to the cost of soap. Nothing dramatic enough to cause public outrage, but enough to slowly compress the margins she had so carefully built. She had started keeping a second notepad, this one in the kitchen drawer, where she wrote the price of 5 staple items every single week: cornmeal, dried beans, soap, kerosene, bread. Just those 5. Watching them move taught her something that would have taken an economics course to learn otherwise. Inflation isn't a headline, it's a pattern, and patterns, once seen, can be prepared for. That same week, she heard about something spreading quietly through the neighborhood. Women on the block had started a small informal arrangement, nothing organized, nothing with a name. If one household had excess from their ration book, an unused butter stamp, a spare sugar coupon, they would leave it in a small tin on Mrs. Clara Webb's porch. Anyone who needed could take. Anyone who had surplus could give. Edna had walked past that tin 3 times without stopping. Pride is a particular kind of expensive, and she was still paying its price without fully admitting it to herself. On Friday evening, she finally stopped at the tin. She didn't take anything. She left 2 unused processed food stamps she genuinely didn't need that week. But the act of stopping, of participating, shifted something in her. Community, she realized, wasn't charity. It was a shared system, not unlike her jars, just spread across several kitchens instead of one shelf. The neighborhood was running its own version of her budget, and everyone, every single household behind every quiet curtain on that street was doing the same invisible arithmetic she was. That knowledge didn't solve the 23 cents, but it made the carrying of it feel less solitary. The day the system almost broke. It happened on a Wednesday morning in late May. Edna was at the kitchen sink rinsing the breakfast bowls when she heard her daughter Margaret call from the back bedroom. Not the ordinary call of a child wanting something, but the quieter, more serious tone that mothers recognize instantly across any distance. She dried her hands on her apron and walked down the hall without hurrying, because hurrying, she had learned, borrowed panic from a future moment that hadn't arrived yet. Margaret was sitting on the edge of the bed, her left shoe in her hand, the sole separated cleanly from the upper, like a book that had finally lost its binding.
The shoes were the only pair Margaret owned. Edna turned them over in her hand slowly, pressing the sole back against the upper with her thumb, as if firmness alone might reattach it. It wouldn't. She had resold these shoes once already in February, at a cost of 30 cents at the cobbler on Larkin Street. The cobbler had told her then, quietly and without cruelty, that the leather upper was getting thin, that there was maybe one more season in them if she was careful. They had not been careful enough, or perhaps careful simply ran out of room. She walked back to the kitchen and stood in front of the shelf. She opened every jar in sequence, slowly, the way you check your pockets when you already suspect they're empty. Groceries had $1.12, needed entirely for the remaining week. Rent was sealed and untouchable. Utilities had been replenished, but held only 40 cents of margin. The children's jar still carried the notation of the 23-cent debt she hadn't yet repaid. Savings held 67 cents, the accumulated result of 11-cent surpluses and Friday discipline and every small denial she had practiced since February. 67 cents. New shoes cost between 75 cents and $1.20, depending on the store and the size.
She sat down at the kitchen table and did not move for several minutes. The children were in the yard now, Margaret playing with one shoe on and one shoe off, too young to fully understand the weight of what was sitting on her mother's shoulders. Edna looked at the savings jar. She looked at the grocery jar. She felt something she would never have called despair. That word felt too large and too permanent for what this was. It was more like a specific exhaustion, the exhaustion of having been careful for months, having built something with real discipline, and arriving at a moment where the careful thing and the necessary thing were pulling in opposite directions. She thought about Raymond, not with longing exactly, but with a particular kind of practical grief, the grief of someone who needed a second opinion and had no one nearby to give it. She had been making every decision alone for 14 months, the leaking pipe, the winter heating calculation, the jar system. Every choice had been entirely hers, which meant every consequence was entirely hers too. She sat with that weight for a few more minutes, then she stood up, because sitting with it wasn't going to sole a shoe. She walked to Mrs. Clara Webb's house that afternoon, not to the tin on the porch. She knocked on the actual door. Clara answered in her house apron, flower on her wrist, and before Edna could arrange her words into something dignified, Clara said, "Come in, I just put coffee on," as though she had been expecting her, as though the neighborhood had a way of knowing when someone had finally decided to stop carrying alone. Over 2 cups of weak wartime coffee, Edna explained the shoes. Clara listened without interrupting. Then she opened her own kitchen drawer and produced a victory bond pamphlet, slightly creased, with a penciled circle around a particular savings figure. "My sister's girl bought her first bond on 40 cents a week," Clara said, pushing the pamphlet across the table. "Took her 11 months, but she bought it." Edna looked at the pamphlet for a long time without speaking. Clara also mentioned that her own daughter had outgrown a pair of shoes just weeks earlier, brown leather, size 4, barely worn. Margaret was a size 4. Edna accepted them without performing the refusal that pride usually demanded. She folded the Victory Bond pamphlet carefully and put it in her coat pocket, next to where she kept the grocery money. That placement was not accidental. She wanted them touching. Edna Marsh never called herself disciplined. She called herself careful. There's a difference, and she knew it. Discipline sounds like struggle. Careful sounds like love.